At this time, it is my pleasure to call to the podium the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, Speaker Todd Gowdy. This session has been his brainchild, and he's very excited to introduce the session and the speakers. So, Mr. Speaker, if you could come up here. Of course, another member of our organizing committee, so come on up.
Well, thank you, Laurie. I just want to say that I'm thankful you don't have to be the smartest person in the room, so long as you're willing to listen to others. And, you don't have to be smart to become wise. And my dad used to read the Proverbs with us every morning. And one of the things that I was emphasized as a child was that a fool rages on in his own confidence, but the wise will listen to counsel. And so today, I think we're in, as was mentioned yesterday, a time of toxic polarization. And so some people would say a debate. Wow, that sounds a little confrontational. But if you consider what we're doing, we're listening to podcasts, we're listening to newscasts that support our bias quite often. And what people will do is create a straw man, defend their position to a straw man who's not there to defend themselves. And when I was a boy, we used to have a thing called the Big Hill. And if you had a big mouth, someone would say, "I'll meet you on the Big Hill." And then you weren't quite as smart as you were before. So we have 3 individuals that are meeting on the Big Hill. And, I'm excited to see willingness. It's a lot more difficult. Victor Thomas, he was one of the ones in the background behind all this. And we were saying, well, who would join in on the debate? Where's Laura Tamaka? She is someone who I had a dream. And when I shared my dream, I got the same idea. And so I am so thankful that we can be here today. And we found some people whose egos weren't here and their capacity was here. We found people who have experience, wisdom, understanding, and they were willing to come in and, for us, not push us into our own bias further through the algorithms. As you watch one thing, you hear more of the same. Here we have 2 servants that are willing to come here and present to us their ideas and hash out very important issues. One of the other things my dad taught me is that if you want to be great among people, be the servant. So these 2 are here to serve us. And what they're going to do is allow us to, as legislators, make good policy. Because we may not be the smartest people in the room, but funny enough, we all have taxation capacity. And we can make sure that we bring those experienced people to the room. And when one person pleads his case, there's another Proverbs, he seems right until the other neighbor comes and examines him. And so we are going to see in the format of monk debates, which again Victor had said we should go off of a format, and so monk debates. But where do you find somebody who would be willing to moderate such a thing? Who has the capacity to ask good questions, who has the capacity to, on the fly, perceive the direction that the thing's going and be able to flesh the issues out for us as legislators. And we have John Gormley here today, and I'm going to introduce John. He is, he's got a long list of accomplishments from his past, but he recently retired, and I enjoyed listening to John Gormley on the radio. And so I've always looked up to him, and my wife heard him in the hallway the other day, and she said, "Oh my goodness, that's," and she didn't know what you looked like. So from his voice, he is recognizable. He's now practicing labor and employment law in Saskatoon here. He, in the 1980s, served 1 term in Canada's House of Commons. So he understands what it is to be a politician. And he is just a man who's written books, has great understanding, and is able to draw people out. One of the things that we can look to a little bit is Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, people like Pythagoras. They used to sit down and have discussions. Nobody was a Republican. They weren't Democrats. They weren't liberals or conservatives. But what they wanted to do was flesh out the issues. And Einstein, what he did was he'd have these thought experiments. He didn't have to go into the lab and test it out. He'd think it through. And so we have not just 1, but 2 and 3 brilliant minds here. So, John, I'll leave it over to you. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you, Speaker Gowdy, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I welcome everybody to Saskatoon. I hope you've had a terrific couple of days. It is my honor to moderate this panel, and I'm going to introduce Louise Miltich and Hal Kvisle to you. And just to set the framework, the question that our two guests will pursue is net zero by 2050 feasible? Now, net zero entered our vocabulary in the first decade of the 2000s. Previously, whether it was Montreal or Rio or Kyoto, we talked about controlling emissions by benchmarking to a year, 1990, 1992, 1997. It was in the first decade of the 2000s that the concept of net zero was born, and it's a shorthand for net zero annual anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And it was popularized in 2015 at the Paris conference. And net zero, my guests are more expert than I, will go further on what it means. But for those of us as lay people, think that over the course of 1 year, greenhouse gas emissions caused by humans would be exactly balanced by greenhouse sinks created or caused by humans. So that's the conceptual framework we're going to work with. Louise Miltich is an advocate of net zero and more than 2 decades of experience in energy development, regulation, and advocacy. She says on her LinkedIn page, quote, "I am passionate about climate, energy, sustainability, and how economic, regulatory, and policy drivers shape human behavior and our impact on the world we live in." Louise is the Executive Vice President of the Great Plains Institute. She's a former Assistant Commissioner of Regulatory Analysis at the Minnesota Department of Commerce and worked for a time in environmental advocacy and in engineering. She has bachelor's degrees in economics and geology and a master's in climate change geoscience. I'd like you to welcome Louise Miltich. Hal Kvisle is a professional engineer with more than 50 years' experience in Canadian and international oil and gas, utilities, and power generation. Hal chairs ARC Resources, a large natural gas company, and he is the chair of the pipeline company South Bow Corporation. His background in directorships and in the C-suite is very impressive. BMO Bank of Montreal, Cenovus, TC Energy, formerly TransCanada Pipelines, Talisman Energy, and Finning, the world's largest cat dealer. Hal questions the feasibility of net zero by 2050. He's also the former national board chair of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and he's the founding chair of the Business Council of Alberta. Hal Kvisle. So we did a coin toss backstage to decide who would speak first in the opening statements. So by way of framework, each of our guests will speak for 7 minutes to the question, is net zero by 2050 feasible? So 7 minutes is a good opportunity to lay out what your position is, why you think what that position is, and as you move to find overlap, to find intersection, sometimes to explore differences. So after the 7 minutes for each of them, we've prepared a set of questions, and I'll ask in random order each of them a question, then I'll ask the other person a question, and then we'll have an opportunity to go deeper on the questions. We want to leave some time for engagement toward the end for you. So there are microphones set up, and we'll wrap up this discussion by questions from the floor, and then we'll finish with a brief closing statement from each of our guests, about 2 to 3 minutes, just to summarize what they've said. So on the opening statement, Louise either won or lost. She's going first. I'm going to ask Louise to address that question, is net zero by 2050 feasible? And explain how she views net zero, the feasibility of the goals, assess the efforts thus far we've seen. So, Louise, let me turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. For 3 straight days in June, I woke up and I put my running shoes on, threw the door open, and I filled my lungs with a choking reminder that climate change is here. And that jarring morning greeting was polite compared to the dangerous menace that fires posed all across our shared region. Headlines read things like 4 provinces, 1 warning, stay indoors, air quality warnings or special air quality statements were in effect across Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. At the time, Environment Canada said the risk was high, especially for vulnerable populations like children, seniors, pregnant individuals, and people with heart or respiratory conditions. And I'll repeat that last part, especially for our most vulnerable. We asked the question, what is net zero? It's a vision for the future that offers opportunity through transformation and protection to our most vulnerable from the most dangerous impacts of climate change. And it requires urgent and coordinated action across governments and industries and communities. What the science shows us clearly today is that in order to avert the worst impacts of climate change and to preserve a livable climate, global temperature increase needs to be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. Currently, the Earth is already about 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in 1800. That's what we know today. And emissions are continuing to rise. To keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, in the Paris Climate Agreement, that's what's called for, emissions need to be reduced by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. So what I say is the challenge is on. The net zero challenge means cutting emissions to a small amount of residual emissions that can be durably stored by nature and other carbon dioxide removal measures, leaving a net zero emissions to the atmosphere. And according to the UN, and I believe this, transitioning to a net zero world is one of the greatest challenges that humankind has faced. It calls for, they say, nothing less than a complete transformation of how we produce, consume, and move about. But what I say is with great challenge comes great opportunity. Transitioning to net zero will be one of the greatest challenges of human time. We have only to look to our past, though, to inspire ourselves to our future. In the early 2000s, experts told us that wind would never amount to more than a rounding error. Solar was a boutique energy. When I began my career, it was just too expensive, it was too unreliable, just a blip on the energy radar, really. And we were told that rural communities would never willingly host these kinds of projects and that clean energy would simply always cost more. But they were wrong. The experts were wrong, and they were not just a little bit wrong, they were wildly, breathtakingly wrong. Today, wind is one of the largest sources of electricity in states like Iowa and Minnesota. Solar is the fastest growing energy source in North America, and some of the strongest clean energy growth is happening in rural communities because farmers, counties, and local governments, and these are real farmers, real counties, whose commissioners' hands I've shaken, are embracing the renewable energy transition because they see real benefits. And wind and solar are the cheapest new electricity sources in much of the world and the fastest to put into the ground. I start here because history matters. What it reminds us of is that technology can outpace our expectations, that communities can lead when they're given an opportunity to, and that setting big goals is really how we make the impossible possible. So that's why I sit here today to say net zero by 2050 is not only viable, it is an essential goal. It is not about inflexible mandates, and you'll hear that from me over and over again. It's about direction. It's about giving farmers and businesses and local communities the certainty that they need in order to plan and invest and to prosper. And no region is better positioned, and I think we heard this in the first panel, no region is better positioned than the Midwest. On both sides of the US and Canadian border, we have the resources, we've got the best wind, we've got abundant solar, we've got productive land, we've got skilled labor, and we have the industries. We've got advanced manufacturing, we've got productive land and skilled labor, efficient agriculture, we've got research universities that are driving policy conversations. And I think most importantly, we have the values. We're practical, we're community driven, and we're focused on real results. So 2050 in that context isn't a pipe dream, it's a way to unlock economic opportunity, rebuild energy independence, and keep the Midwest competitive in a global market that is moving, and it's moving with or without us. I understand concerns about cost, reliability, and fairness, but we're already seeing success. Local communities are securing tax base and jobs from new wind and solar. Tribal nations, I've seen it, are shaping early engagement to avoid the conflicts of the past. Manufacturers are retooling to supply clean energy components, and utilities are providing clean energy while keeping power and reliable affordable. If we ignore this opportunity, we don't freeze time, we fall behind. The status quo is not static. Other regions, other countries will come in and they will claim the industries and jobs of the future, and what we'll be left with is just bearing the costs of climate impacts without reaping the benefits of the transition. But if we lead, if we set that goal, and if we stay flexible in our tools to get there, and we center ourselves on community leadership, we can make this transition work for us, for rural towns, for tribal communities, industrial workers, and for future generations. I believe in the Midwest's capacity to lead because I've seen it happen on a project by project basis, community by community. This isn't idealism. What it is, what 2050 is, a pragmatic path to prosperity. And I'll lead with that.
Louise, thank you very much. Now, on the question that we asked today, is net zero by 2050 feasible? Hal Kvisle, I turn it over to you and explore, if you will, or respond, if you would like, to some of the points that Louise has made.
Thank you, John. So I'm not opposed to net zero by 2050 as an aspirational goal. And the whole notion of net zero, as John mentioned, was created about 20 years ago. And it was created as an aspirational goal by the climate change movement to get people focused on the magnitude of what needed to be done in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and the impact on the environment. The problem is, in a practical sense, it's an enormous undertaking. And 30 years ago, just over 30 years, or just about 30 years ago, the Kyoto Protocol was entered into by many nations of the world, including the governments of Canada and the United States. And the Kyoto Protocol of 1996 committed the advanced economies of the world to meet binding emission reduction targets. They agreed to reduce their emissions while allowing the less developed countries to continue to grow their emissions. And there were some very complex formulas for transferring financial assistance from the developed to the undeveloped world and things like that. The protocol failed. The global emissions have increased by more than a third since that protocol was entered into back in the 1990s. And notably, the United States Senate declined to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, even though the President of the United States at the time was behind it. In Canada, we did ratify and support the project, but after about 15 years of no progress, we gave up on it and Canada withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. We realized it would not be effective. So then about 20 years ago, climate activists proposed 360 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere as the absolute maximum that we could tolerate without triggering some sort of a climate crisis. And today, the atmospheric concentration is 427. Emissions blew through the 360, have reached 427 parts per million today, and will probably continue to grow and go up, not because Canada and the US are increasing emissions or driving the increase, but because the less developed parts of the world want the kind of standard of living that we enjoy here in North America, and they continue to demand more energy, and they generate more energy, and that increases emissions. So what we realize today is that energy is one of the most fundamental drivers of economic well-being. And as every economy in the world has come up the curve and achieved a higher standard of living, it's always been accompanied by a greater demand for and use of energy. Now, in the world today, we're looking increasingly at electricity as the way to get there. And the electrification of everything is ultimately going to be the single biggest change that will drive reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions. But even the generation of electricity relies heavily on hydrocarbons. In the United States, you've made great progress in shifting from coal-fired generation to natural gas combined cycle, which reduces emissions by about 60%. Now, the Trudeau government in Canada was overly zealous about this, and they actually imposed a carbon tax on natural gas, which took away, really, the option of converting coal-fired power to natural gas and reducing emissions by 60%. It's a perfect example of the pursuit of the perfect getting in the way of what we can do to actually make progress in a practical sense in the near term. So net zero, the approach really asks all countries to make two commitments. The first, that we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, cut them in half by the year 2030, and remove them almost entirely by the year 2050, and that's the amount that we emit. And then, as Louise pointed out, we would offset all remaining emissions by removing enormous quantities of greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, either by capturing those greenhouse gases at the point of emission and sequestering them underground, or by actually attempting to remove CO2 from the air in the room. So it faces three big hurdles that I, as an engineer, I worry about. The first one is that mankind shows no sign whatever of reducing fossil fuel consumption. Over the past 5 years, the past 10 years, or the past 20 or 50 years, the consumption of fossil fuels has steadily gone up year after year after year. And early in my career, globally, we were consuming 50 million barrels a day of crude oil. Today, we're consuming 104 million barrels a day of crude oil. I mean, it's just a steady upward trend. Over the past 25 years since the Kyoto Protocol was entered into, mankind's annual consumption of oil has risen by 35%. Natural gas consumption has more than doubled, and even coal consumption, driven primarily by the less developed world, has doubled over that period since we entered into Kyoto. So we enjoy these massive economic benefits from it, and that's really the first hurdle. How do you get mankind to reduce its consumption of hydrocarbons? The second one is that there really are no practical technologies today available for reducing the emissions that come when you burn hydrocarbon. We look at putting carbon capture and sequestration facilities on the back end of power plants to capture the CO2 that would otherwise go up the exhaust stack. This has been a work in progress for a long time. I was involved in my first carbon capture project back in 1982. And we did all the work, we made it work, and then we concluded the amount of horsepower required to capture and compress that CO2 made the whole thing impractical. So there's a lot of history behind that. So the second hurdle is that there's no practical way to capture the emissions. And then the third hurdle, we talk about how do we remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere? How do we take it? Now, you know, if it's hard to capture CO2 that constitutes about 10 or 15% of the gases coming out of a smokestack, think of how hard it is to capture CO2 out of the atmosphere where the CO2 concentration is only 427 parts per million. It's a tiny amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So those are the hurdles. Number one, mankind continues to demand fossil fuels. Number two, we have not come up with effective ways of capturing the CO2 post-combustion. And number three, the idea of taking CO2 directly from the atmosphere is an interesting concept. The most effective way to do it today is by planting trees, and I'm fully supportive of that. As John mentioned, I'd been part of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and we were very supportive of that. I just worry about the practical engineering challenges of getting to the finish line.
Hal, thank you very much. So you've heard two presentations, each of our panelists. So now I'm going to go back and forth with a series of questions that we've run by the panelists, and I hope we reflect some of your questions, and if we don't, of course, we will have time at the end for the microphones and you. Louise, let me start. You had mentioned the success of local initiatives and how you talked about making the impossible possible. Do you agree that at a larger scale, the scope and the scale of decarbonization, there will have to be in certain sectors fairly significant reductions in the emissions of not just greenhouse gases, but in particular carbon dioxide? And if so, you look at sectors like aviation, you look at cement, fertilizer, steel, the withdrawal or the decarbonization in those sectors will be disproportionately high because, of course, those are carbon-intensive sectors. So how do you see that challenge, and how do you see the cost?
That's a great question, and one that I was expecting to hear. Cost is something that comes up over and over again in these conversations. And what I ask myself is not only what is the cost of doing these kinds of advancements that we need to make in order to embrace our trajectory toward net zero, but what is the cost of inaction? And really, as I said, the status quo doesn't stand still. The status quo is moving, and what we know is that climate change is happening, and there is a reality in the economics that shifts over time. And I think as we look out to 2050 and we ask ourselves about the costs, we've got innovation, and we've got smart people and practical people who can help us get to the finish line, the 2050 goal. But the important thing to realize right now is that although we don't have all the answers for how all the final pieces come together, that direction, that policy direction that can give the certainty that businesses and people and communities need in order to continue to move forward on that path is really critical. And what we hear from industry, you talk about deep decarbonization in some of these sectors. I see those not only as a challenge, but again, really as an opportunity. There's a National Renewable Energy Lab study that was out earlier and that we've talked a lot about in our work at the Great Plains Institute that identifies the Midwest as really like a key place. It's got all of the right resources to embrace the kinds of deep decarbonization that we need in exactly those sectors. So what I say from my perspective is we need to take the opportunity to seize those pathways toward net zero and create a really robust ecosystem of different industries that are those industries that are deeply decarbonized, and they're really well connected to one another. They all need clean feedstocks of hydrogen, clean feedstocks of CO2. So we see that opportunity coming together in the Midwest.
Hal, on those industries and the decarbonization pace or scope, and again, those industries, it's generally conceded, will be the most significantly affected in the short term. How do you respond to Louise's point on the cost of inaction and what the costs that will be borne would be?
So I think the cost of inaction is uncertain at this stage. Back in the early 1990s, had we continued to release CO2 in the direction we were going, it was predicted by the climate change activists that we would be well into a major climate emergency at this point in time. The reality is that emissions have continued to increase, energy demand has continued to go up. Yes, there are weather events that often occur, and sometimes those are attributed to climate change, but has the emergency actually landed upon us? I don't think it has yet. And so my argument would be we need to step back from extreme aspirational goals and work through the detail of how are we actually going to make this happen. And a big step, that was made in the United States was to shut down a significant amount of coal-fired generation and replace it with natural gas combined cycle. And that, I think, has been one of the major drivers, one of the main reasons why the United States has actually reduced its CO2 emissions per capita and has reduced its CO2 emissions as a percentage of GDP or related to GDP. In Canada, because we took a more aggressive approach by putting the carbon tax on natural gas and making it quite difficult to build natural gas combined cycle plants, we really fumbled the ball. We failed to achieve the reduction in emissions. We put all of the money into building wind and solar, and the wind and solar just don't work all that well if you don't have natural gas available to back them up when the wind isn't blowing and when the sun isn't shining. So my argument would be we need to recognize long-term we want to get there. We need to recognize that for the environment and for energy security and many other reasons, we need to continue to get better and more efficient at the way we generate energy. But we can't accept the notion that mankind's going to stop using this stuff. It's going to take a long time to work our way through it. I do believe electrification of almost everything is a big part of the answer. Then we need to put a lot of time and effort into how are we going to produce the electricity that's going to be needed to do that.
Let me ask you a question stemming from that, and then I'll turn it back over to Louise to respond. Do we have the ability today and by 2030, because that becomes our mid-benchmark, and then by 2050, so let's look at those 3 points in time, do we have the ability to meet global energy demand through low emission or emission-free technology?
I think the facts are that we don't. I think the enormity of transforming what is the largest industrial activity in the world, which is the production and delivery and consumption of energy, this is an enormous undertaking. And we have the concepts. We understand what can be done. But as we heard this morning, to build out the kind of nuclear fleet that you would need to build in order to displace a fair bit of hydrocarbon-generated electricity is going to take a long time. And it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's got to go through regulatory processes that drag everything out far longer than they need to be. So I think if we want to make progress, it's got to happen in a series of stages over the decades. One of the first things we can address is the regulatory process that makes it difficult to do carbon reduction projects, just as it makes it difficult to do pipeline projects or energy developments or anything else. So I think we've got a lot of hurdles to overcome. I just think it'll take longer.
Louise, in response, on the ability to meet global energy demand, is there short, medium, and longer term ability through emission-free or low-emission technologies?
I love the question, and I think the answer is there has to be. I'm keen on this 100%, the net zero by 2050 and believe that we can achieve it. Are all the solutions out there on the table with can I clearly tell you this is what we'll do in 2030, this is what we'll do in 2035, this is what we'll do in 2050? No. What I've realized in preparing for today is that there are lots of different trajectories, different pathways that you can take to get from where we are today to net zero. All of them involve some, innovation and some expectations about the future that we can't completely draw and look at and admire in this moment. But that's been the reality for the kinds of challenges that we face that are the big challenges of humanity forever. We can't necessarily see all the pieces that come together in the future, but what we can do is we can put smart people together in a room. And when you ask about rising energy demand, we see the future expansion of AI and the advent of data centers. The reality is, whether we like it or not, energy demand is growing, and that's not where we expected to be 10 years ago. When I started my career, energy wasn't a particularly exciting place to work, and it's really become that because of the possibilities and because of the, I think, uncertainties about what the future looks like as we look at our energy transition. Now, we've got wind and solar resources that are really the quickest to build and to permit right now. We had a great discussion before this about nuclear and how that might become part of the picture. And on top of that, we've got communities, I think, that are working from the ground up to find what those solutions are. We work with communities every day who think about their own energy security, and they want to build the energy that is going to be their future. And they create a template, I think, for other communities so that it's not a top-down mandate of 100% renewable energy or net zero by 2050. It's really coming from communities that want to create their own energy independence. They want to create their energy resilience. And they too are challenged by the realities of these big, AI and data centers coming in and contributing to the demand on the system. It's an open discussion and debate that I think we've had really good input from lots of people in our state and I think across the Midwest about how to meet that demand. And we're starting to meet it every day with solar and battery and wind And the technologies that take longer to get in place, including things like fossil fuels with capture and storage, are part of the picture to net zero by 2050.
So let me go further, and then with the next question to you, and then I'll go back to Hal. You're talking about energy generation or production. On the other piece of net zero, of course, is to capture or sequester greenhouse gas and then to remove them. Is it workable and reasonably economic, whatever the proportion is that you would rely on carbon capture and removal, is that today or midterm or longer term feasible and affordable?
I think the economics change over the course of the trajectory toward 2050. Today, the challenges are real. We're in prototype phase. We've got, I think, excellent opportunities to capture pure streams of CO2 on our ethanol facilities, for example, and to experiment with that market and transporting CO2 and sequestering the CO2. So yes, there are real investments that are being made in that space. It's a big part of the work that we do. You know, I think we had the luxury maybe 30 years ago to look at our climate issues and say, I think we'll just, you know, do renewable energy and we'll create this future that doesn't require some kind of carbon capture and storage. But the reality that we face right now is that, to Hal's point, the atmospheric CO2 levels are such that capture and storage is part of the solution that we have to look at on our trajectory to 2050.
So Hal, let me turn that over to you. Capture and removal, mid-longer term, is it feasible, is it affordable?
So this is one of the most interesting questions, is all about carbon capture and sequestration and the process that we need to go through to do that. And just to explain it a little bit and some of the work that I've done in this area, we had the example in Alberta of a 1,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant. And we looked at installing carbon capture on the back end of that plant so that of the hot gas at atmospheric pressure that comes out of the smokestack, about 10 or 15% of it is greenhouse gas, CO2. And when we looked at what we would first have to do is take that hot gas and compress it in order to get it densified up to a point where you could run it through a process that would remove the CO2 from the other gases, and then further compress that CO2 to go into a pipeline and be injected into a reservoir underground. And we did all the detailed technical work on this because it was quite important to us to figure out a way to keep that coal-fired power plant on stream.
Did you do it on budget? On budget?
Well, we didn't actually build the project because what we discovered was that it was not only going to cost a couple of $2 billion to do it, but we were going to take a 1,000 megawatt power plant and turn it into a 600 megawatt power plant because it would take 400 of the 1,000 megawatts to run the compression equipment to deal with the CO2 that we're removing from the stack. So that was the Achilles heel of the whole project, and that's where it got abandoned. When you take a 1,000 megawatt plant, turn it into a 600 megawatt plant, and spend several $1 billion to get there, you triple the price of power that's delivered to the consumer market. Now, as Louise pointed out, maybe we have to absorb these costs over time in order to get to the objective that we need to get to. But the problem is that when we looked at doing that in Alberta, nobody else was doing it in the rest of North America. When we look at doing it across North America, people in Asia are not doing the same thing. And so part of the problem with the whole CO2 question is how can you take action at the local level when the rest of the world is not doing it? This becomes a major part of the problem. But it's expensive. We did test the technology. We knew it would work, but it was attacking a very delicate problem with a sledgehammer. And those kind of solutions generally don't work over time.
We talk policy, and obviously this is a great forum for policymakers to discuss this, but ultimately anything in policy translates to the end use, the consumer, the public, the voter. And I want to explore both of your points of view a little bit on the question of the impact of net zero on individual citizens. Are people going to buy this, Louise?
I've long said if we could get people as excited about climate change as they are about their cell phones, we would be all set. So it's a fair question whether people are going to buy this as part of the package of what they see in the world today. But I think the reality is, as we see the climate shift, again, the status quo is not static anymore. As we see the status quo shift, as we see the impacts of climate change, the reality is that citizens don't get to lead the kinds of lives that we led 10, 20, 30 years ago when you look at what climate impacts are out in, for example, 2050. And so what we want to do is we want to put citizens, consumers, businesses on a trajectory with some guardrails and some backing of the political will to get us to to net zero by 2050, so that citizens see that trajectory for their future. And you are all lawmakers. You have to deal with and talk to the citizens what they really worry about. And as a regulator, I knew that this was true, is the number that shows up on their electric bill. There are a lot of conversations that need to happen about costs that don't show up on your electric bill, the costs that happen to your roof when the hailstorm comes through, the insurance realities that you face when you're trying to insure your home. And so I think as an economist by training, I really see the economics shifting over time and the kind of lifestyles that people are able to have shifting over time, and that moving the critical mass of people toward the reality of accepting the new and exciting things that come with net zero by 2050.
Aside from cost, and you make a good point about how we allocate or apportion cost, are we asking people to change the way they live, to actually dislocate or change their standard of living?
I think when you get down to it, the answer is no. We're not asking people to change their standard of living. We're asking people to modify the way that they interact with the economy. So for example, we're asking people to have smart appliances that connect to the grid and speak to the grid, or cars that you plug in and are doing work for the grid while you're sleeping. So what we're trying to do is create a world where, yes, there are changes in consumer behavior, people are purchasing EVs, but that the ways that they interact with, for example, the grid are fairly seamless. So you're not counting out the hours that your car is plugged in and then thinking about the tariff that you're on with your utility. It's really as simple as parking your car in your garage and plugging it in. And I think we've got a lot of smart people working on these kinds of, I call it a challenge and an opportunity because it is fun stuff when you think about the way that cars can communicate with the grid in the future and the ways that we're going to be able to do peak shaving, for example. So what we're looking for is ways to keep consumers involved and maybe aware in a way that they haven't been in the past, but to engage in a way that's relatively seamless with their lifestyle.
Hal, on those two questions, the cost to consumers and the larger question of, do people have to live a different life under net zero? And in any event, are the people going to buy it?
So I think, let me start with the second question about, will people have to learn to live different lives in order to accommodate all of this? I think yes, there'll have to be changes, but I think if we attempt to move large populations to a different lifestyle as a matter of urgency, well, it doesn't work. We find that you just can't get there that quickly. Things need to evolve. Evolution rather than revolution is the way these things normally unfold in big, rich, complex societies. So it's going to take a little bit longer to get there. As to the cost, I think Canada offers a pretty good example right now, that the Trudeau government imposed a carbon tax which drove our gasoline prices to significantly higher levels and drove the natural gas cost of heating homes and running industrial enterprises to much higher levels that our competitors were facing in the United States, where there was no carbon tax. And eventually, the burdens of all of those things became problematic. All along, activists have indicated it's big industry that has to change in order to do this. The evil oil industry is responsible for these emissions. They need to do something about it. Well, in Western Canada, if we eliminate all the emissions related to the production of oil and natural gas, we'd reduce emissions by about 15%. The other 85% of the emission comes from all of us when we burn gasoline in a car, when we burn natural gas to heat our homes. And it's as those costs start to flow through to consumers, and we all know that consumers never have quite as much money as they wish they had, it can create these kind of negative backlashes. And this is where I think we need to be careful at the pace at which we go ahead with some of these things. We need to allow time for society to adapt, and the kind of really urgent action approach that the Trudeau government took just really resulted in a negative backlash in Canada. So we got to be careful how we go about it. Now, we heard this morning about the opportunities for nuclear power to have a big impact, and I'm a big supporter and a big fan of nuclear energy. But just when you think about the dollars involved and the amount of time and the number of 5-year periods that it takes for each of these projects to be developed and move forward, you know, we've got about 5-year periods between now and 2050. And that's the issue with net zero by 2050, is you have to work on these things in segments of 5-year periods about designing and getting regulatory approval and going ahead with stuff. And that is, I think, one of the major challenges we face. So it's not just about the consumer backlash, it's about the engineering challenges, the regulatory process, and all the other things that take quite a while to get there.
I did want to get your response, Louise, as somebody who's worked in the regulatory space. Do you agree with Hal? When we break it down, that's 5-year units. Is it doable?
So, having worked in the regulatory space, I will tell you things can take a long time. That is the reality. But what I also know from working in that space is that there's a tremendous capacity for discussion around permitting reform. It's a phrase we hear over and over: permitting reform, permitting reform. We had amazing success in the state of Minnesota during the 2024 legislative session, where we passed permitting reform for energy infrastructure projects, and it was inspired by an incredible stakeholder process that brought together disparate points of view, but with a very clear directive from the chair of our Public Utilities Commission to make some progress on permitting reform. And the reason it came from the Public Utilities Commission is because they have ownership of the permitting for large energy infrastructure projects in Minnesota. And with that, I mean, I'd call it sort of a policy directive. Our chair of the Public Utilities Commission said, come together as people with different opinions and get permitting reform done. And we made meaningful changes to the amount of time that it takes to get single projects put in the ground on energy infrastructure projects in our state. So I just have an amazing belief that we can do permitting reform, that we can, as regulators, be practical and see, 5-year increments and shrink them down to 2. There's an important component of public engagement and social license to do these kinds of projects that simply takes time. But I would argue that with early engagement of communities by both industry and government, we can shorten permitting timelines. And I think that's a space that we really, if you look at this being, I don't think we're diametrically opposed when it comes to permitting reform. I think there's some really, really good progress that we can make on that front.
On that question of policy setting and government regulation, I mean, it's not mutually exclusive. Obviously, people can act by suasion. They can also act under government fiat or law. But are we getting it right in terms of regulation of policy setting versus persuading people?
I think that we're experimenting in a way that will show us the course toward the right mix of those two things. Really, we're having a debate here about this because it is uncertain how much policy direction you need and how much government oversight is necessary to move us along the trajectory toward net zero that's required. What I am confident in is that we will find the right mix and that it is both. We need this policy framework that gives, and that lasts for more than 4 years, right? There's a political will that I think has to transition or has to transpire across multiple 4-year periods to give business and industry and communities the confidence that this is the direction that we're moving in. That comes from a policy place, not purely from a marketplace.
Now, you're distinguished from Hal because Hal was living under 9 years of Justin Trudeau, where regulation was clearly the preferred option. But Hal, let me flip that to you. What is the balance between government regulating standards toward net zero and driving people by public suasion?
So it's interesting, I come from the pipeline business, which has been a major focus of regulatory delay. It's been very difficult to get a pipeline built from any point A to any point B because of the amount of regulatory process that we need to go through. And interestingly, most of the regulatory challenges that we've created were created by environmental activists who wanted to delay the construction of pipelines and the delay of oil field developments and things like that. Interestingly, now this comes back to bite them, because having created these nightmarish regulatory processes where nothing can get done, well, you can't get carbon capture and sequestration projects approved in any reasonable time frame either. In fact, we've been building pipelines without significant environmental impact in North America for over 50 years. The original Trans-Canada pipeline from Alberta across Ontario and into Toronto and Montreal was built effectively with no environmental oversight whatever. They were said, here's where you go, here's where you're going to build, just get out there and get it done. And my predecessors at Trans-Canada did exactly that, and they got it done. Well, today it's a 7 or 8 year process just to get through, to get a permit to build a pipeline, when the whole history is we have not been causing environmental damage by building these pipelines anyway, and yet this is what we have to go through. So I think from a regulatory point of view, it's going to take us a decade. It's going to take at least 10 years to go through the process of re-examining the regulatory hurdles that we put in place and figure out which ones do we need and which ones do we not need. And none of this happens with a wave of the magic wand. This is going to take a lot of discussion, a lot of input from people, a lot of engagement with communities, and at some point, we're just going to have to decide, do we want the project or not? In Canada right now, there's all this kind of talk about what can we do to get oil pipelines built to the Pacific coast, or get oil pipelines built to Eastern Canada, or more natural gas pipelines built to LNG export facilities. Well, none of it's actually happening, because until the government is prepared to pass legislation saying that we want this project to go ahead, proponents are not going to be prepared to get behind it. And I don't want to go on and on about the challenges faced by hydrocarbon companies, but I think there's a real lesson there in terms of the regulatory process that we're going to have to improve if we want to be able to build things like wind and solar and the backup gas-fired generation to enable wind and solar to operate. It's just going to take a while. We've got to work through all of this stuff. And in the meantime, we need to continue to meet the demand, and we need to keep the lights on, and we need to heat houses in the winter when it's cold, and vehicle fuels need to continue to be produced. So I think it's a long game process. I think we might get halfway to net zero by 2050, and that would be an enormous accomplishment for mankind if we got halfway to net zero. It's just that the process to get it all is, a lot of those nuclear plants that we talked about this morning are going to have to be built, and they all take time.
I'm curious about carbon offsets. This is something else that we hear debated, and just as net zero has kind of moved in on what we were doing 20 years ago in trying to have the 1990 levels or 92 levels, Are we hearing a different discussion on carbon offsets? This, of course, is where you still ostensibly do activities that generate carbon, but you pay an offset. I know people in the climate change community have been skeptical, sometimes openly critical. The people who are critics of net zero have criticized it because they argue it's ineffective. Where do you come down on the use of carbon offsets and where you see them going?
I am a pragmatist by nature, and so when you say offsets, I say yes. But I say yes, and with the right parameters around those offsets. So what I believe is that it's important on an economic basis to have an option for folks to create offsets where it's most possible to do so, and then to take those offsets and within the economy shift them over to a space where they're needed. We talked about, really difficult to decarbonize industry, for example. You may go through all the steps of really targeting efficiency and getting efficiency in place and doing renewable energy, and you come to a place where you really need to squeeze down those final emissions, and the solutions may not be there at the time that you need to make those reductions, and that's where offsets are really important. However, it's critical that the offset be two things, not duplicative, right? You want an offset that is not unbundled, for example, from the producer. You want to make sure that that offset is only being sold one time and that it indeed represents a reduction in emissions in the system. And the other thing we need to make sure is that it's additive and that it isn't an offset activity that would have been done anyway. It's the question is, but for me purchasing this offset, would this activity have happened? So I think those are the critical things to keep in mind with offsets. I don't see it as a shell game. It has to be real. It has to be not a paper shuffling exercise, but a real offset that's been created and can be purchased over here. That creates the kind of flexibility that I want to see in the trajectory toward net zero.
Hal, do you have a view on the use of carbon offsets and any evolution in the way we perceive them?
So the whole offset market started not long after the Kyoto Protocol was put in place 25 years ago. And there were all kinds of humorous stories about, for example, the Chinese manufacturing facility that was shut down 5 times and each time received very significant offset payments to shut down, and then they'd start up and receive more payments. So there were those kind of things going on. At the other end of the spectrum, just take Canada. If we're going to really fully believe in and embrace in the concept of forest offsets, well, Canada could be excused for just downing tools and doing nothing to reduce our emissions, because the amount of carbon that is absorbed by the great northern boreal forest, which starts not too far north of Saskatoon here, dwarfs the amount of carbon we absorb in Canada every year, dwarfs our own emissions. So we could just say we don't need to do anything, and I think that would be counterproductive. You can see that offsets, on the one hand, should be considered, and to the extent that we can come up with good offset practices and good administrative processes and security processes around them, well, this is good. But let's not use offsets as the excuse to not do anything else. We have to continue to develop cleaner sources of electric power generation. We have to continue to build cars that run more clean and efficiently. And I think offsets have a role, but we've got to be careful that they don't actually set progress back on the other fronts.
I'm curious listening to you because there is some overlap and this is a good example, this question of carbon offsets. Let me ask you a question that's semi-personal. Both of you are passionate about your positions. You're both informed. I'm curious, is there a particular point that's made by people on the other side of the debate that you think to yourself, I kind of agree with that? And conversely, is there a point that people on the other side of the debate make that you say, I really object to this? So I want you to think about that. And Hal, let me turn that to you. I mean, when you get engaged in the net zero debate, is there some part of this on the other side that you find yourself embracing?
Yeah, I do. I mean, like a lot of people in this room, I have children and grandchildren, and I don't want them to inherit a world that my generation completely messed up. We don't want that. So we need to do everything we can to protect the environment. I mean, there's been great progress made in my adult lifetime, which is getting pretty long now, but there's been great progress made just in environmental protection, and the way we operate in any number of industries is far cleaner today than it was back in 1970 or in the 60s. So we continue to make progress. My issue is this old question of the pursuit of the perfect getting in the way of accomplishing something good. And this is where I think things like the Kyoto Protocol and the 360.org objectives of almost introducing scare tactics to stop people or to get people excited about reducing emissions, these can be counterproductive because they create an element of impossibility that if you can't get there, why try at all? I think much more can be gained by proceeding in a stepwise way. What the United States has done to replace an awful lot of coal-fired generation with natural gas combined cycle. I'd highlight that one of the best things we can do in power generation is to have an equal mixture of wind and solar with an equal amount of natural gas-fired rapid response power plants to back it up. And if you compare that to pure gas combined cycle, you can reduce emissions by 80% after you already reduced them by 50% in going from coal to gas. So think of it as a series of optimization steps. We go from coal-fired power plants to gas combined cycle plants to a power system where 70% of the output comes from wind and solar, and the other 30% is gas-fired backup during those critical hours of the day when you need it. If we proceed in that way, we can continue to make a lot of progress, and I just think the outcome will be better than if we shoot for the moon and don't quite get there.
Okay, so let me summarize. What you find attractive about arguments from the other side is the shared responsibility for the environment of the earth. What bothers you are the scare tactics and the extremism.
Yeah, and I think just to the extent we're not realistic about what we can get done within certain time frames, it actually sets us back. And so I just would like people to bring a very realistic approach to all of this, and let's do it. Let's look at what's happened. You know, when we look at, we've got 25 years from now until the net zero date of 2050. Well, we've been at this for 25 years since the Kyoto Protocol was passed, and everything's gone in completely the wrong direction. So maybe you got to step back and say, are we looking at these things the right way? And what can we do to focus more on, I guess I would say, engineering fundamentals, and what can we get done that's actually going to work?
Louise, when you watch this debate and participate in it, the upside and the down, did you find something about arguments that Hal and people in Hal's camp make that you find attractive? Conversely, the ones that really bother you?
I think the most compelling thing that I hear on both sides of this discussion and in the discussion generally about our trajectory with the transition of our energy system is the word community and the word discussion. So I think I heard Hal say community and there are discussions going on. There need to be discussions. The communities need to be engaged. That's the part that I really absolutely agree with. I think we're wholeheartedly in agreement that none of this transition can happen to communities. It needs to happen with communities. A big part of the work that I did before I came to the Great Plains Institute involved going and sitting in gymnasiums in little towns in western Minnesota and talking to real people about projects that were proposed in places that they live, in places where they will see them every day, but also in places where their county tax coffers are going to benefit from having those wind turbines there. So what I would say is I'm in wholehearted agreement that regardless of the path forward, discussions in community are absolutely what needs to shape where we're going. On
the disagreement side?
On the disagreement side, I have my nose wrinkles every time I hear it's too expensive. I think the reality is we find a lot of ways to pay for a lot of things. I was at the National Convention of Utility Regulators a couple years ago, and I remember one of the public utility commissioners saying, and this will stick with me forever, we don't have a cost problem when it comes to electricity generation. We have an allocation of cost problems. There are a lot of things that we can afford to do. It's a matter of allocating those costs appropriately and protecting the people who need to be protected so that their lights stay on, so that everybody's lights stay on. And so that's the part I would take the biggest disagreement with. And I may be a dreamer, but I think we've got a trajectory toward net zero with practical people, engineers that will help us find the way there.
Let's go back to political will. We've talked about policy setting, we've talked about regulation. Recently, the president's order, the executive order withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement, which will be actioned 1 year later, so it's in the process of decoupling. That, not just alone, but as part of the landscape today with Paris, how important is national and international political will?
I think ideally it is really important, but what I see is that despite the change in the political winds that we have witnessed over the recent times, the communities that we work with and the states that we work with who have built the kind of, they've built momentum toward things that they want to do, and regardless of whether that overarching policy framework is there at a federal level, there is a motivated collection of people, and we see this in red states and blue states and purple states and in counties and in cities, that there's a desire to be involved in the energy transition and to capture the opportunities that we have that exists regardless of that overarching. You talk about political will, I think the durable will is at the community level and at the state level, where times are shifting, but the commitments that were made over the last 4 years and the kind of trajectory that was put in place over the last 4 years continues to inspire the work that's going on.
Hal, how do you see that question of national and international political will?
So I'd look at it this way, that there are roughly 1 billion people in the economies in the world that have the financial wherewithal to make a lot of progress on this. It's the United States, Canada, it's Europe, it's Japan, it's those countries. And in aggregate, they might be roughly 1 billion people. There's about 7 billion other people in the world that are continuing to demand ever higher amounts of energy. So as we look at where are the policies that will change all of this, it's not really important what the American government does or what the Europeans do or what Canada does. The big question is what's happening in China, what's happening in India, what's happening in that big part of Southeast Asia that's another 1 billion people between the 1 billion in India and the 1 billion in China. We really have to look at what those economies are doing, and we have to do what we can to help them along. And it is encouraging, that on the one hand, China is continuing to build coal-fired power plants and continuing to increase their CO2 emissions. On the other hand, they're actually attacking the problem where it really counts at the consumer level by building the world's largest electric vehicle fleet and the world's largest fleet of generating stations. So we kind of went off the tracks here in North America a little bit when we blamed ExxonMobil and the energy industry for climate change. The reality, it's all of us as consumers that are emitting most of the emissions, and we need to really attack it from a different direction. So I'm encouraged that in places like China, you're seeing them actually do some things, not everything they need to do, but they're doing some things to reduce their emissions at the consumer level. We need to do more of that here, but again, it's going to take time.
Let me now, in the remaining minutes, invite you. There are microphones in the 2 middle aisles, and this is a great opportunity for the Q&A. You've heard each of our guests. You've heard an array of points. You may agree, you may disagree, you may find some intersection or overlap. So let's go to the microphone. Hello.
Hello, thank you. I'm State Senator Terry Bryant from Illinois. So Illinois recently passed a law, ICEJA, and so I jotted just a few notes down. I won't take very long, but just a few notes in regard to some of the things that were said. So you may want to comment on what I say rather than as a question. First of all, the comment about rural communities voluntarily participating. They're not voluntarily participating in Illinois. They're being forced to participate because we took away their local control in a second bill the following year. So some legislators voted for that bill because they were guaranteed local control, and then the following year we took away their local control, right? So the wind and solar subsidies, that even though they're being reduced or eliminated at the federal level, Illinois gives very generous subsidies to wind and solar. So the prices are artificially lowered. So it looks like that it's economically feasible to do it. So grandma and grandpa are saying, let me go ahead and put solar on my good farmland. And then companies are taking advantage of the carbon credits because they're not emitting the CO2 emissions from the coal plants, but going on good farmland where previously that CO2 was processed naturally by soybeans, corn, hemp. That's not happening now. So the farmer doesn't get those carbon credits for naturally processing. I was happy to hear you talking about trees, right? The other things that happen are sequestration. So we're ordered to, I have a coal plant in my facility, which is one of the cleanest coal-fired plants in the United States. However, it's ordered to be closed by 2035 if it can't sequester, I think it's 45%, while the environmentalists in our state don't want core space sequestration and also don't want the pipelines. So while we could take it through pipelines and use it for sustainable aviation fuel, the pipelines are not going to be there. In addition to that, my electric bill this time last year was $240. I live in the MISO region. This year it was $680. So that is, in the MISO region, supply and demand, right? So if you go to those energy auctions and the demand is high, supply is low, the auction is going to come back not favorable to the consumers. And then I would lastly say in this conversation, one of the things that I didn't hear economically, and maybe you could address this, is the byproducts of coal-fired plants that are also going to be an economic issue going forward. So for instance, gypsum and fly ash. So if you need gypsum for drywall and you need fly ash for cement, what are we going to do in the future? Because right now, if you try to go and do anything to your house and you have to try to buy drywall, there's a shortage of drywall, and that is part of the reason. And also having to put nitrogen on soybeans now, which is also produced through a byproduct of coal. So there you go. Lots of questions for you. Sorry I wasn't on the panel.
You've laid out an impressive array.
I know.
Who wants to go first, Louise?
I will pick on the thread of local control and state level permitting. I was very interested to see the developments. In Minnesota, we have a state level permitting process, and it was during the 70s that the state of Minnesota determined that they would like state level control as opposed to, kind of a county by county permitting of infrastructure. And at the time, it was really about transmission lines and wanting to have the ability to route transmission lines from point A to point B with relatively straight line through the counties. And there was, at that time, so much disagreement about hosting that energy infrastructure that the state felt that oversight was needed. But the really important thing, and I think operationally this is critical, is for that state ownership to be really sensitive to what the local ordinances are. And I think we see really good examples in Minnesota of our Public Utilities Commission taking the time to ensure that there's public engagement at the community and that those community people have the chance to speak to their regulators and shape what projects look like, even though there is that state level overall direction to the permitting. It's not permission to discount what communities have to say.
Hal, when you were thinking of those different points.
Well, let me address this by describing a situation that unfolded in Alberta about 10 years ago. You heard, interestingly, from former Prime Minister Stephen Harper yesterday. And during the Harper government's time, all of the different utilities in Canada, the oil and gas companies, a bunch of the big heavy industrial users, we all got together and worked closely with the Harper government to come up with a plan for how we were going to go about reducing emissions from the power gen, the electric power gen sector. And what we agreed was that each coal-fired power plant in Canada would be allowed to run out its primary licensed life, so that if it had a 20-year initial permit, it would be allowed to run out that 20 years, recover most of its invested capital. But at the end of that period, industry agreed we would not attempt to life extension or expand or replicate or do any of those kind of things. We would just work our way out of that, and at the end of that period, it would be replaced with some cleaner form, and it might have been subsidized wind and solar, and we'd figure out how to integrate that into the system. Well, everything changed politically. That the Harper government was replaced by the Trudeau government. The Conservative government in Alberta was replaced by a left-wing government. And Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Notley made an agreement over the weekend to rapidly accelerate the shutdown of all the coal-fired power plants in Alberta. And what they overlooked was that there were several $billion of payments, compensatory payments, that would have to be made to the companies that held the long-term contracts. They also failed to recognize that the building of 4,000 megawatts of wind and solar to replace 4,000 megawatts of coal doesn't work, because the wind and solar only operate a third of the time. And the outcome of all of this is that the cost of electricity in Alberta more than doubled. And all of us as consumers in Alberta are now paying more than twice as much as we would have if we had just worked our way through a well-thought-out plan. So it was really a question of political initiative and political aspiration kind of trumping what a bunch of us grizzled old engineers had come up with, a plan that we thought would actually work. And this is where I just think we've got to be careful in how we go about these things. Now, as to the point of national agendas and national aspirations versus what happens at the local level, interestingly, again, in Canada, so much of our federal political position is determined in Ontario and Quebec. And in Ontario and Quebec, they do not have hydrocarbons, and so going electric and nuclear and river hydro and all of those things makes all kinds of sense. And at the provincial level, those kind of things really work well. They don't work so well in Saskatchewan and Alberta, where we don't have the river hydro and we have not advanced the nuclear industry. And so in Canada, we've had a fair bit of friction between what the federal government, Ontario, Quebec policy wants us to do and what's actually practical at the state or provincial or local level. And those kind of things just need to be worked through. And again, they take time.
Okay. Question at this mic.
Good morning. My name is Diljit Brar. I'm MLA for Burroughs in Manitoba. Just before lunch, let's talk about food. We are wasting 168 million tons of food every single year in North America, which is worth $278 billion. I have two questions. One, how big is this piece in the problem pie? Number two, what kind of opportunities and challenges does this situation offer to us for net zero 2050?
Thank you. Louise.
Yeah, I think there are tremendous opportunities when it comes to managing food waste and managing the emissions from food. I appreciate the statistics. I couldn't roll them off the top of my tongue like that, but the reality is we've got tremendous progress that we could make in managing the methane emissions from our food. It's not one of the core things that we do at the Great Plains Institute. We don't have a dedicated group that works on food-related emissions, but it's an incredibly important part of the picture, and I'll leave it at that.
Hal.
Yeah, I think it's like so many other things that as we look at where waste occurs and what we could do about it, it's kind of a continual optimization process. You get better at the way you grow it, you get better at the way you distribute it, you get better at the way we waste less of it at the dinner table. And all of these kind of things take time. And, you know, I think society is much more committed to addressing that sort of waste than it was 20 or 30 years ago. 20 or 30 years ago, we just shrugged our shoulders and ignored it. So I'm actually hopeful that we can make good progress on food waste. And the whole agricultural value chain is a big part of the issue. And we're, of course, very big on agriculture here in Western Canada. And I know the Midwest part of the United States is an enormous agricultural producer. So we're kind of all in this together. And I think we can continue to focus on it, but it won't happen overnight. It'll take time.
Before we wrap up with 2 minutes for each of our guests, we have time for one more question, and I apologize to the other people at the mic, but there'll be some things we can talk about at lunch. So, go ahead, sir.
We'll be here.
Thank you so much. My name is Jeff Bariza. I'm the Deputy Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Manitoba. I'm going to ask my question first and then explain it. So my question to you is a simple one. How will people afford to eat? So I'm going to qualify that with, as the panelists were talking about, we were faced with a carbon tax in Canada here. So I just want everybody to know that we did a paper, a loaf of bread, one loaf of bread. The consumer will pay carbon tax 15 times on that single loaf of bread. The Midwest of the US and the prairies of Canada are feeding the world. And I think that's important to realize as well, too. With a combine, it runs 24 hours a day in a lot of cases. That cannot run on electricity. How will we heat our barns? How will we dry our grain that is needed to make canola oil that our largest we export to China and the United States for things like sustainable aircraft fuel or things like that? We can't do that currently with the type of things we're looking at. Farm equipment cannot be run on wind, solar, or electricity. We cannot charge more for the commodities that we are growing because they are sold on a global basis. We are crushing these products, but what we're doing is the population of the world continues to grow. The Midwest of the US and all of the Western Canadian provinces are doing a big job to do that. We cannot afford to starve people to death because of what we're looking at today. We must look at this as a timely thing to do, but to put a timeline on this project, to do this, people will starve to death, and they don't deserve that. So
Jeff,
again, I'll go back to my question.
Thank you. It was a great question. Ask it, and then we'll get an answer.
How will people afford to eat? Thank you.
Thanks.
So, being old and somewhat hard of hearing, when you asked the question, I wasn't sure if it was how can people afford to eat or how can people afford to heat? Now, actually both strike to the same point, that as we shift to ever more expensive sources of energy, whether it's expensive new nuclear reactors or whether it's subsidized wind and solar, all of these things add costs. And they're going to increase significantly the cost of the food that we eat. They're also going to increase, particularly in the northern states and in Western Canada, how we heat our homes and how we survive winter. And I think one of the key things is enabling our industries to compete on a level playing field. If Canada is imposing a lot of carbon taxes that drive costs up, we can no longer compete with the Midwest US. If the Midwest US imposes those things, it can no longer compete with certain foreign operations. And so this is where it gets quite complicated. How do we approach this problem at a global level, recognizing that whatever you do to reduce emissions in Eastern Canada does not affect the weather in Eastern Canada. It's a global issue and a global concentration of CO2. So we've got to pay attention to what it costs to survive cold winter, what it costs to put food on the table, and we've got to proceed in a way that doesn't make it impossible for people to get what they need.
So Louise, how can people afford to eat with some of the rising costs on climate?
Yeah, I think you have to believe that there is an urgent problem here that needs to be solved when it comes to climate change. And you have to believe that there's a future that puts people's ability to both heat and eat in peril. And that we need to act now in order to prevent the outcomes from climate change that we believe will transpire if we don't change our actions. And so I argue this is the only way we can afford to eat, is to take a really thoughtful approach to net zero by 2050. And you really have to believe in the premise that there's an urgent problem that we are trying to solve.
So if I asked each of you in 1 minute, we've had a great audience here today. What do you want the audience to walk away from this panel thinking, Hal?
Well, I think number one, I think all of us in the room share a concern about the environment. And not just from a global warming perspective, but from a land protection, clean water, clean air, the kind of environment we're going to leave for people in the future. So in that, I agree very strongly with Louise that we need to be serious about analyzing and understanding and approaching these things. At the same time, there are the real constraints and challenges of cost, of meeting other demands that people have, of keeping society functioning well, and just enabling people to get by. And we can't impose things that make that difficult. So it's an enormously complicated problem. The world very much depends on the 100 million barrels a day of oil and the hundreds of millions of amounts of natural gas, and everything's in the hundreds of millions in this game. The world depends on that. We've got to proceed carefully so that we don't really disrupt our economic system. And we've got to do it in a way that enables North America to continue to be competitive at a global level. We can't put burdens on here that other parts of the world don't. That's the message I'd like to put across.
Louise, the last word to you, what you'd like our audience to think about today.
I think if I left the audience with a single word, the word is opportunity. The future we're talking about is really not about forcing rural communities to carry the burden of new energy infrastructure. It's not about penalizing industries that have built our region's prosperity. And it's definitely not about leaving any family wondering whether they can keep their lights on or afford their next energy bill. What it's really about is setting a direction. It's about setting that shared target and solving problems together, adjusting as we go, talking to each other, getting in rooms together, not one time between now and 2050, but continuously as we slide around along that entire trajectory. I think it gives us a common horizon to work toward, and it gives us good discussions to have like the one we've had today. And so that's what I would leave the room with, is just the vision of opportunity, and it's one that we need to seize or it moves past us.
Ladies and gentlemen, Louise Miltich and Hal Kvisle.
Thank you.